Good morning and welcome to this morning's session and today's deliberations. I hope you had a restful night. So today we move on with our first panel of this morning, which as you see from the program, is on economic growth and its impact on poverty and inequality in sub-Saharan Africa. And to moderate the panel, we have Dr. Joyce Chija. She's a professor in the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. So we are delighted to have her here. She came all the way from South Africa, only came 2 days ago. So we're happy that she's here to join us. So she will introduce the panel and moderate this session. So, Dr. Chija.
Thank you, Professor Muna, and good morning to all of you this morning. We will be going down south in Africa, the most exciting part of the continent, this morning to continue our discussions on growth, poverty, and inequality. In introducing the panel we have this morning, we have Professor Andy McKay, who is Professor of Development Economics at University of Sussex. Amongst other things, Professor McKay is also advisor to bilateral donors in the UK Department of International Development. So we welcome you to Ithaca, Cornell. We are looking forward to your talk this morning with us. Our second speaker is Professor Augustine Fosu, who's Deputy Director of the University of Wider, a visiting scholar of Ghana. We are delighted to have you. Amongst other things, he's an honorary member and research associate at University of Oxford. Next to him, we have from beautiful Kenya, we have Professor Jane Kabubo Mariara, who's a professor of economics at the University of Nairobi. She is also Associate Director and Senior Lecturer in the School of Economics at the University of Nairobi. Amongst other things, she's also a research person in the African Economic Research Consortium. We welcome you, Professor Jane. And lastly, we have Professor James Murphy from the University of Clark here in the United States. He told me earlier on he drove over 300 miles. I didn't ask him at what speed, but he's here and we welcome you. Professor Murphy is a professor in geography, and he has done his work focusing on dimensions of economic development and technological change. He told me he's also done some work down south with colleagues there. So we look forward to all your deliberations this morning. And I thank you. Can we begin with our first deliberation this morning?
Good morning. I have the happy task of doing the first presentation at 9 o'clock, 10 past 9 on Saturday morning. I would like to just begin by referring a little bit to Eric's contribution to work on poverty analysis in Africa. Eric has played a huge contribution to developing poverty analysis in Africa, and especially through the African Economic Research Consortium, which was established in the late 1980s, with at that time a strong focus on macroeconomic issues. That was the focus of the time. These were the days of stabilization and structural adjustment, and understandably, AERC started with a macro and trade focus. In the mid-90s, they developed a program on poverty, a major collaborative project on poverty, which Eric played the leading role in developing. trained many African researchers to analyse poverty in their different countries. Many of them came to Cornell and other places at different times. These are now some of the leading poverty researchers in Africa. Part of what I'm going to talk about today draws on some of their work. Part of what I'm going to talk about today draws on a collaborative AERC project looking at the linkages between growth and poverty reduction. This involved 13 sub-Saharan African case studies. Eric and I were both involved in this project as resource persons, but the work was done by African researchers, most of whom had been trained as part of the AERC poverty project. Jane here is one of them. What I'd like to talk about very briefly is the growth story. We know that, we've talked about that repeatedly. I want to focus a little bit on monetary poverty, not because monetary poverty is the most important one. There are many aspects to poverty, as we well know. But monetary poverty is difficult and is contested. And people have different views and debate within a country. I'll briefly refer to inequality, but the main focus is going to be poverty. Then I'm going to say something about non-monetary indicators. We've had quite a lot of that discussion of that already yesterday, but I'd just like to refer to some non-monetary indicators. And then talk a little bit about the variation of success, which is what we're going to see across countries in Africa. One cannot get away, and this was again a point discussed yesterday, one cannot get away from thinking about data issues when one's talking about these questions. So I will refer to that from time to time. We all know that there's been a substantial growth recovery in Africa since about the mid-90s. We think of it as the last few years. It actually starts further back. It actually starts, if one looks at the aggregate GDP for sub-Saharan Africa, there was meant to be a chart there, I'm sorry there isn't. It starts from about the mid-90s. Of course, it accelerates in the last 10, even 5 years. Many of you will know the book of Stephen Radley about emerging Africa, where he talks about 13, soon to be 17 emerging countries in Africa, many of those in blue there, for example. We all know about The Economist talking about many of the fastest growing countries in the world being in Africa. What we don't know so much about is what's happened to poverty. So what I'm going to try and do is take a view across Africa, but by focusing on the biggest 24 countries. The biggest 24 countries covers more than 90% of the sub-Saharan Africa population. When we look at growth story for these countries, 20 out of 24 of these have grown between 1995 and 2010. 11 of them increased their income by more than 50% over that 15-year period. And there's different explanations for this growth story. Radley talks about that, many other people do. It's not just a story of commodities. There's 11 cases where the growth rate is bigger than, where GDP per capita increases by more than 50% over that period, Angola being at the top. There are only 4 cases where it doesn't, and really only Zimbabwe is a disastrous case here, because even Democratic Republic of Congo, which declined over much of this period, substantially recovered in the last few years. Now, talking about data, GDP data is also criticised and challenged, and many of you will know the work of Yervin, severely criticising the quality of national accounts data in Africa. We know that Ghana, by revising its GDP numbers, suddenly became a middle-income country just because of revising its national accounts. Can we trust the growth data? Even if we don't trust the levels of GDP, can we trust the growth rates? To some extent, we can use our surveys and look at growth and consumption in surveys and see to what extent that's similar or not to estimated growth rates, but of course they're different concepts, so they're not completely comparable. My sense is, though some of the issues that Yervin raises are right, I don't think anyone can question this significant growth recovery. So monetary poverty. The World Bank in 2012 gave us a story for the aggregate level of poverty, reducing from 52%, well, 59% in 1993, 52% in 2005, 47% in 2008, and even in that later period, the absolute number of people that were poor fell slightly. But I want to look at a country level. And I want to look at a country level with survey data. Now, we know that the World Bank compiles poverty data in POVCalNet, World Development Indicators. But the problem with those data sources is that they tell us very little about where the data comes from, where the questionnaires come from, to what extent the data is comparable. And I know from knowing some of these countries that some of the data is not comparable. So instead of that, what I'm going to do is try and rely on carefully conducted country studies, where we trust the judgment of the authors, where we trust, where we assess and judge that they have put an appropriate focus on comparability and used an appropriate method. We're also going to focus on national poverty lines. It's a country level focus. We don't need to think about exchange rates. Now, of course, monetary poverty is highly contested. It's complicated. There are lots of choices to make. It needs to be done carefully. I talked about the AERC project. I'm going to focus on 10 countries included in the AERC project, 9 of the top 24, plus also Benin, which was also in that project, and 9 others where the poverty analysis appears to be being done also to a good standard. So we can say something about 18 out of the 24 in terms of monetary poverty. Unfortunately, we can't say something about important countries like Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan. We were talking about data problems yesterday. I think one of the data problems is that we need to know more information about some of these big countries. That is the poverty change in the poverty headcount in the AERC case study countries. Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, and so on. And the first thing, a casual observation of that, shows that in every case, poverty falls over that period. In Kenya, it's touch and go. In Malawi, it's pretty small. But in all of the cases, poverty falls. Now, this is taken from figures in this AERC project, but updated in a couple of cases where there are more recent surveys. There's more recent data for Burkina Faso, there's more recent data for Ethiopia, there's more recent data for Nigeria than was included in that project. In some cases, such as Nigeria, when the 2010 data was published and compared with the 2004 figures, the 2004 figure was revised. So I am comparing 2010 there with the 2004 figure that was published at the same time. Note that in Nigeria, although poverty falls between 1996 and 2010, there's a big increase between 2004 and 2010. There's the other countries. Mostly it's the same story. Mostly it's the story of reductions. Uganda, one has quite fast reduction. Mozambique, one has a reduction and then a slight increase. But we have a couple of cases of increase here. Côte d'Ivoire and Zambia over the 1990s. But in 16 out of these 18 cases, poverty is observed to fall. But not always by a lot. There are big sustained reduction in about 5 cases. Ethiopia, Ghana, Rwanda, Senegal, Uganda. It falls significantly but not monotonically in some other cases. Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mozambique, Cameroon, over the period, poverty falls. In many other places, including South Africa, in reference to our chair, the poverty reduction is significantly smaller. Kenya and Madagascar, there's little change. Côte d'Ivoire and Zambia in the 90s, there's an increase. Now, of course, all of these are specific to the periods. We can only talk about the time for which we have surveys. So we cannot necessarily interpolate or extrapolate from these figures. If one uses World Development Indicators, one can add a couple of other countries. World Development Indicators does give us some national poverty line figures. There's some others. Chad, unfortunately, those surveys are not comparable. Chad was an AERC case study country. Those surveys are not comparable. Niger, there's a modest reduction. Zambia, there are comparability issues between some of these later surveys. And Zimbabwe, we see an increase. We still don't have 3 countries. We still don't have Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan. And the last 2 are certainly important. Okay, let's talk about the data. How much can we trust it? Can we trust the data? My sense is that household surveys now in Africa are generally of fairly good quality. Of course, it varies from one country to another, but I think the quality of the base data is probably reasonable. But there's so many adjustments in calculating poverty, and often one very big one is the need to adjust for price differences. Even if one has decent consumption data, if you don't have decent price data, we may not be able to measure monetary poverty in a reliable way. There's also often questions of comparability of surveys. I've already referred to that in the context of the World Development Indicator data. Often the questionnaires change, and therefore the data are not necessarily comparable. The next thing is that the results are often contested. Mozambique is a case in point. Mozambique, I showed that story, that poverty fell a lot between the first 2 surveys, and there's a modest increase between the second and the third. That is contested. That's a study done by Channing Arndt and Finn Tarp and others from Mozambique, but it's contested. The World Bank has a different view. A Dutch study has a different view of reduction in poverty. What about Nigeria? What's going on here? How does poverty go up so much over that period when it's a period of rapid growth and when inequality only increases a little? So results are often contested, are often discussed, and there's not always 100% agreement. And let's be clear, the omitted countries, probably the record is worse. The countries in which we don't have data are probably also either poorer countries or countries that are making less progress. Democratic Republic of Congo. Okay, but we've had poverty reduction in 16 out of 18 of those countries. But how much? Is it big? And given the growth rate, is it a decent reduction in poverty? Now, of course, many are familiar with the growth elasticity of poverty idea. For a given rate of growth, how much does that translate into a reduction in poverty? Well, what I'm doing here is just comparing the percentage change in poverty, headcount, with the annualized growth rate. And here are cases where the percentage reduction in poverty is greater than the annualized growth rate. These are both annualized over the relevant periods for when the surveys were conducted. Uganda, Ghana, Senegal, these are cases that have quite impressive rates of poverty reduction, even though they also have quite good rates of growth. The poverty reduction rates are in excess. We have cases where poverty doesn't fall. We've already talked about Cote d'Ivoire and Zambia. Madagascar and Nigeria in sub-periods also have increases of poverty. But what about the rest? The rest, which is a lot, which is 10 countries, the rate of reduction of poverty is less than the annualized rate of growth. If one was to take a ratio of that as being a crude growth elasticity of poverty, it's pretty small. It's less than 1. Now, we've got to be careful. There's limited poverty observations. We only know the years to which we have survey. We also don't have a lot of poverty data for the most recent period. But I think the general point is the ability of Africa to translate growth into poverty reduction has not been particularly strong. There has been good growth. There hasn't necessarily always been commensurate reduction in monetary poverty. Now, Revallion in recent work suggests that low income not only is a constraint on growth, but also may lead to a lower growth elasticity of poverty. So that low income may be part of the story, part of the issue. Is this a story about an increase in inequality? Well, if you look at the data, basically no. Yes, there are cases where inequality went up, and they're high-profile ones, but in many other cases, inequality fell. If one takes the data at face value, if one trusts the data, inequality fell in at least as many places as it increased. But here is, I think, where we have to be really concerned about data quality. This, I think, is by far the least accurate source of data. We are not getting significant parts of the population, in particular high-income populations. I think there are serious questions about the reliability of the inequality data. We talked about multidimensional poverty yesterday. We talked quite a lot about non-monetary indicators. I'm just going to refer briefly to a couple, just to see to what extent this story is or is not comparable to the monetary poverty story. Here we have more data. DHS surveys are available in all of the 24 countries. Sorry, 23 of the 24 countries. In 2 of them, we only have 1 observation, so we can't look at changes in time, but we can in 21. If we look at mortality, under 5 mortality, it falls almost everywhere. Not in Cote d'Ivoire, not in Zimbabwe, again. Very slow change in Chad, but generally it falls significantly. Okay, so there are some countries with Ethiopia, for example, Ghana, Madagascar, countries that have managed to reduce their under 5 mortality quite significantly. Now, Ghana and Ethiopia did quite well in poverty terms. Madagascar didn't, but reduced its under 5 mortality. Niger, which didn't do particularly well in poverty terms, reduces its under 5 mortality quite a lot. If one looks at malnutrition, we don't have as many observations because it wasn't always collected. But the general story is of improvement. This is the percentage of children underweight, but not always. Cameroon, Kenya. Mostly, though, this is a positive story. We all know, of course, that school enrollment increases a lot over the period, and that happens almost everywhere. But the level of enrollment, especially at secondary, still remains low. Use of health services, vaccinations, deliveries in health facilities, again, improves in most places. Contraception, again, improves, but remains very low. This is a pattern of general improvement, and often at quite fast rates. And if one does just the same exercise, this isn't really a valid exercise, but if one just looks at the percentage improvement in the under 5 mortality rates compared to the percentage change in GDP, there are many cases, many more cases, where the under 5 mortality rate improves at a faster rate than GDP growth. The story here is generally a more positive story, is generally a story of more rapid, more positive change. Less positive, there was a paper by Young 2 or 3 years ago, which was extremely positive. I wouldn't put it as positive as that. But this is a positive story. But this is not necessarily a growth story, because growth is not necessarily strongly linked to these outcomes. Now, resources matter. Resources matter for education. Resources matter for health. Resources matter for all these things. But growth is not the only source of resources. Aid potentially could be important. There are many cases, we saw in Madagascar, where non-monetary indicators improve, although monetary poverty doesn't. Nigeria is another case in point. Where the monetary poverty successes, in the monetary poverty successes, they also tend to have done well in non-monetary terms. Ghana, Ethiopia, Senegal tend to have done well in non-monetary terms as well. Try to combine the stories a little bit. These are different measures. They're not measuring the same thing, and we shouldn't expect them to tell the same story. They often don't go together. And growth matters much more for monetary poverty than non-monetary poverty. There are countries that have done well in everything. Ghana's and Senegal's and other countries have done well in everything. They have improved all their indicators at quite fast rates. They often have rapid poverty reduction relative to their growth rate. But these are often countries with good policy and good institutional environments. And that is almost certainly an important factor, not just in delivering growth, broad-based growth, but also service delivery. There's something else which is often true in those countries. Look at the decline in the fertility rate in Ghana, for example. Compare it to, for example, Malawi on the right, Burkina Faso on the left, which have made significantly less progress. Not saying anything about causality, but there seems to be there may be some sort of association. Okay. Growth elasticity remains low in Africa of poverty reduction. We've talked about low income. Progress in non-monetary indicators, better health outcomes, better education outcomes, potentially could be important for future growth. Maybe, but I don't think we know this, maybe that enables faster poverty-reducing growth as well. Okay, growth has generated monetary poverty reduction, but there's a big variation in performance. There are countries that have done well, unambiguously and clearly well. These countries are likely to meet or have already met the first Millennium Development Goal. But mostly, monetary poverty has not responded well to growth. Non-monetary indicators have generally done better. That, of course, is an important and valuable outcome in its own right. It may also be good for the future, in terms of future growth, in terms of perhaps more effective poverty-reducing growth. Thank you very much.